The courtroom fell silent as a 10-year-old boy in an oversized suit jacket stepped forward, his small hands clutching a briefcase that had seen better days. Judge Harrison's gavel hovered mid-air, frozen in disbelief. "Your Honor," the child's voice rang clear despite the tremor in his hands, "I'm representing my mother today." The prosecution laughed. The gallery whispered. But in that moment, as morning light streamed through courthouse windows, nobody knew they were about to witness the most extraordinary legal defense in Georgia's history, delivered by a boy who had memorized every law book his mother had left behind. What would you do if the entire system was against you and your only hope was a child? Malik Thompson stood 4 feet tall in his Sunday shoes, the ones with the scuffed toes that his mother, Angela, had polished until they almost looked new. His dark skin glowed with the determination of someone far older than his years, though his round cheeks still held the softness of childhood. The suit jacket he wore had belonged to his grandfather, a man he'd never met but whose presence lingered in the careful stitching and faded silk lining. Malik had found it buried in a closet box marked Memories, alongside yellowed photographs and letters his mother never spoke about. In the defendant's chair sat Angela Thompson, a woman whose quiet strength had been mistaken for weakness too many times. Her nursing scrubs, pressed but faded from countless washes, told the story of double shifts at Grady Hospital in Atlanta. Her hair, usually kept in neat braids, now showed signs of the 3 weeks she'd spent in county jail, unable to make the inflated bail set by a judge who'd taken one look at her zip code and decided her fate. Angela's eyes, the same deep brown as her son's, held secrets that even Malik didn't fully know. On her wrist, barely visible beneath the court-issued metal cuffs, was a small tattoo, the scales of justice with a date. May 15th, 2012. Few people knew what that date meant, but for Angela, it marked both an ending and a beginning, a promise made in a different courtroom, in a different life. Her fingers, skilled at inserting IVs and comforting patients, now trembled slightly as she watched her son approach the defense table. She'd tried to protect him from this world, from the weight of injustice that had crushed her own dreams. Yet here he stood, carrying a briefcase she recognized all too well, her old one from law school, hidden for over a decade in the back of their apartment's only closet. The prosecution table overflowed with suits and briefcases, led by District Attorney Richard Crosswell, a man whose political ambitions were as polished as his Italian leather shoes. To him, Angela Thompson was just another case number, another conviction to pad his statistics before the upcoming election. He'd already given interviews about cleaning up the streets, using Angela's arrest for alleged drug possession as his poster case, never bothering to investigate why a nurse with no criminal record would suddenly have drugs appear in her car during a routine traffic stop in Buckhead, far from her usual routes. Crosswell's team consisted of 3 junior prosecutors, each eager to impress, each viewing Angela not as a human being but as a stepping stone in their careers. They shuffled papers with practiced efficiency, occasionally glancing at Malik with barely concealed amusement. A child playing lawyer, what a story they'd tell at the country club tonight. 12 years ago, Angela Thompson had been Angela Richardson, graduating summa cum laude from Emory Law School. The photograph hidden in Malik's briefcase showed her on that glorious May day, baby Malik balanced on her hip, diploma raised triumphantly in her other hand. Her smile in that photo radiated pure joy, the kind that comes from achieving the impossible. She'd been the first in her family to finish high school, let alone law school. Her mother had cleaned offices at night to help with expenses. Her grandmother had sold her wedding ring to buy Angela's first set of law books. Every late night studying, while baby Malik slept in a carrier beside her desk, had been fueled by their sacrifices and her determination to build something better. The bar exam results had arrived on a Tuesday. Angela remembered because Malik had just started crawling, and she'd been baby-proofing their tiny apartment when the mail came. Top 5% in the state, a score that had caught the attention of Peterson, Klein, and Associates, Atlanta's most prestigious law firm. They'd offered her a position before the official swearing-in ceremony, impressed not just by her scores but by her thesis on reforming the criminal justice system to address racial disparities. She'd accepted immediately, seeing doors opening that had been closed to people like her for generations. For 6 months, she'd thrived at the firm. Her colleagues had initially been skeptical. A young black single mother from the rough side of Atlanta didn't fit their image. But Angela's brilliance in the courtroom had quickly silenced doubters. She'd won her first 3 cases, each victory building her reputation as a formidable advocate for justice. Then came the case that changed everything. Darius Williams, 17 years old, accused of robbing a convenience store in Midtown. The evidence seemed straightforward: security footage, a witness identification, recovered money. But Angela had noticed inconsistencies. The timestamp on the footage had been altered. The witness had connections to a known drug dealer who operated in the area. Most damning, she'd discovered that the arresting officers had a pattern of planting evidence on young black men, then offering to reduce charges in exchange for becoming informants. Her investigation had led her deep into a web of corruption that reached from street cops to city officials. Bank records showed mysterious payments. Case files revealed dozens of wrongful convictions. She'd compiled everything meticulously, preparing to expose not just Darius's innocence but an entire system of injustice. The first threat had come as a whisper in the courthouse elevator. A man she'd never seen before had stood too close, his breath hot on her neck. "Beautiful boy you have," he'd said. "Be a shame if something happened to his mama." The second threat had been less subtle: photos of Malik at daycare slipped under her apartment door, each image timestamped to show weeks of surveillance. The message was clear: drop the case or lose everything. Angela had spent that night holding Malik, feeling the weight of a choice no mother should face. Justice for Darius and countless others, or safety for her son. By morning, her decision was made. She'd withdrawn from the case, citing personal reasons. Darius Williams had been convicted, sentenced to 15 years. Angela had resigned from the firm the same day. The transformation from Angela Richardson, rising legal star, to Angela Thompson, night shift nurse, had been deliberate and complete. She'd legally changed her name back to her mother's maiden name, moved to a different part of the city, and enrolled in nursing school. Her law degree went into storage, along with her suits, her legal books, and her dreams. For 12 years, she'd built a new life centered on healing rather than justice. She'd worked double shifts to pay for Malik's school supplies and soccer cleats. She'd attended every parent-teacher conference, helped with every homework assignment, been both mother and father to a boy who asked why they didn't have family photos from before he was 5. The only remnant of her past life was her late-night ritual. When Malik was asleep, she'd pull out her hidden law books, updating herself on changes in legislation, reading Supreme Court decisions by lamplight, keeping her mind sharp for a future she couldn't imagine but couldn't quite abandon either. The present nightmare had begun 3 months ago on a rain-slicked Thursday evening. Angela had just finished a 16-hour shift when she'd witnessed City Councilman Morrison's Mercedes slam into a homeless veteran at the corner of Peachtree and 10th. She'd rushed to help, her medical training overriding caution. The veteran had been badly injured but alive. Morrison had stumbled from his car, clearly intoxicated, fumbling for his phone to call someone, not an ambulance, but someone to fix this. Angela had already called 911, giving her name and location, describing the scene in the clinical detail of a trained professional. She'd stayed with the victim until paramedics arrived, not noticing Morrison's aide photographing her, capturing her license plate, making notes. 2 weeks later, during what should have been a routine drive home, blue lights had filled her rearview mirror. The traffic stop had been professional at first: license, registration, the usual questions. Then the officer had asked her to step out of the vehicle. The search that followed had been thorough, too thorough for a supposed broken taillight. When the officer had emerged from her car holding a bag of white powder, Angela's heart had stopped. "Well, well," he'd said, his smile cold. "Looks like we've got ourselves a drug-dealing nurse." The arrest had been swift, public, designed for maximum humiliation. Local news crews, tipped off by an anonymous source, had been waiting at the precinct. Her mugshot had been on the 11 o'clock news before she'd even been processed. The 3 weeks in county jail had been a masterclass in systematic degradation. Angela's bail had been set at $50,000, an amount carefully calculated to be just out of reach for someone living paycheck to paycheck. Her court-appointed attorney, Thomas Brennan, had visited once for 15 minutes, suggesting she plead guilty for a reduced sentence. "The evidence is overwhelming," he'd said, not meeting her eyes. "Think of your son." But Angela had seen this playbook before. She knew the drugs were planted, knew her witnessing Morrison's hit and run was the real reason she sat in a cell that reeked of industrial disinfectant and hopelessness. The other inmates had recognized her innocence instinctively, offering her protection and comfort in small ways: an extra blanket, a warning about problematic guards, a listening ear when the weight became unbearable. Outside the jail walls, the destruction of Angela's life had proceeded with ruthless efficiency. Grady Hospital had suspended her immediately, their HR department citing a zero-tolerance policy for criminal charges. The local news had run segment after segment about drug problems among healthcare workers, using Angela's photo as their prime example. Her co-workers, people she'd covered shifts for during their family emergencies, who'd shared her homemade lunches and borrowed her shoulder to cry on, suddenly found themselves too busy to return her calls. Even her church, where she'd volunteered in the children's ministry for 5 years, had suggested she take a break until things were resolved. The speed with which her community abandoned her spoke to deeper fears, the knowledge that in certain zip codes, association with the accused was almost as dangerous as accusation itself. But the cruelest blow had come in the form of a Child Protective Services investigation. Malik had been pulled from his 5th-grade classroom, escorted to the principal's office where a stern-faced caseworker waited with a clipboard full of invasive questions. Did his mother use drugs? Did strange people visit their apartment? Had he ever felt unsafe? Malik, wise beyond his 11 years, had answered with the careful precision of a child who'd absorbed his mother's lessons about how the world saw them. Every word measured, every response crafted to reveal nothing that could be twisted. He'd returned home that day to find an official notice taped to their door. CPS would be conducting home visits, evaluating his safety and welfare. The subtext was clear: cooperate or lose your child. The media circus had intensified as the trial date approached. Channel 5's investigative team had produced a special segment titled Nurses and Narcotics, a Hidden Epidemic, featuring Angela's case prominently. They'd interviewed anonymous sources who claimed to have seen suspicious behavior, though none of these sources seemed to exist in real life. The prosecutor's office had leaked just enough information to paint a damning picture while maintaining plausible deniability. Richard Crosswell had given impassioned speeches about his commitment to cleaning up our healthcare system, using Angela as a symbol of everything wrong with modern Atlanta. He'd stood on the courthouse steps, cameras rolling, promising swift justice for the betrayal of public trust. The fact that no patients had ever complained about Angela, that her record was spotless, that she'd received commendations for her compassionate care, none of this made it into the narrative being crafted for public consumption. Even Angela's neighbors had turned against her. The apartment complex where she'd lived for 8 years, where she'd organized community gardens and tutoring programs for local kids, had become hostile territory. Mothers pulled their children away when Malik walked by. The landlord, citing a clause about criminal activity, had posted an eviction notice, giving them 30 days to vacate. Anonymous notes slipped under her door suggested she move somewhere more appropriate for her kind. The careful middle-class life Angela had built, brick by brick, was crumbling faster than she could shore up the walls. Each day brought new humiliations, new losses, new reminders that in America, accusation was often as good as conviction for people who looked like her. The night before the trial, Angela had sat on the narrow bunk in her cell, holding Malik's latest letter. His usually neat handwriting showed signs of stress, words cramped together as if he was trying to fit everything he needed to say onto the limited paper aloud. Mom, I found your old case files. I know what they did to you. I know why you stopped, but you taught me that truth matters. I've been reading your books, all of them. I understand now. The weight of those words had nearly broken her. She'd sacrificed her career to protect him, only to end up here, facing the same corrupt system with even less power to fight back. For hours, she'd wrestled with accepting Brennan's plea deal. 5 years with good behavior could mean 3. Malik would be 14 when she got out. Maybe they could start over somewhere else, somewhere her past and present couldn't find them. But as dawnlight filtered through the small cell window, Angela had remembered why she'd become a lawyer in the first place. Not for prestige or money, but because she'd believed in justice. She'd believed that truth, properly presented, could overcome lies. That belief had been beaten down, buried, but not destroyed. Looking at the evidence list Brennan had carelessly left during his last visit, she'd seen what any first-year law student should have caught. The chain of custody for the drugs was broken 3 hours unaccounted for between the traffic stop and booking. The arresting officer's report contradicted the dashcam footage in crucial details. The witness who'd supposedly seen her acting suspiciously had connections to the same network that had threatened her 12 years ago. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every person railroaded by a system designed to generate convictions, not justice. Angela had spent those pre-dawn hours writing legal notes on the only paper available, toilet tissue and the backs of commissary forms. Citations from memory, precedents that could challenge every piece of manufactured evidence. She'd outlined a defense strategy that Brennan would have developed if he'd spent more than 15 minutes on her case. As she wrote, she'd felt a familiar fire rekindling. The same fire that had carried her through law school while raising a baby alone. The same fire that had made her dangerous enough to threaten 12 years ago. But as the guards came to transport her to court, reality had crashed back. Brennan wouldn't use her notes. He'd probably already drafted his closing argument for a guilty plea she hadn't agreed to. The game was rigged, had always been rigged. She was just another black woman caught in its gears, ground down to make the machine run smoother. The courtroom had been packed that morning, every seat filled with spectators drawn by media coverage and morbid curiosity. Angela had entered in shackles, the orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the power suits worn by everyone else. She'd searched the gallery for Malik, finding him in the third row, wearing his grandfather's too large suit jacket. Their eyes had met across the space, and she'd seen something in his expression that made her heart simultaneously break and soar, determination mixed with knowledge beyond his years. He'd been sitting next to Mrs. Chen from their building, the only neighbor who'd still smiled at him, the only one who'd agreed to bring him to court when CPS had initially refused to allow it. Judge Harrison had entered with the pompous ceremony of a man who enjoyed his power too much. Angela had recognized him immediately, the same judge who'd set her impossible bail, who had connections to half the city's elite, including Councilman Morrison. The same judge who'd been photographed at Morrison's campaign fundraisers, who belonged to the same country club, whose wife served on the hospital board that had suspended her without investigation. The fix was in from the highest levels, a coordinated effort to silence a witness who'd seen too much. As Croswell had risen to deliver his opening statement, Angela had closed her eyes, preparing for the inevitable. She'd fought the system once and lost. This time, she didn't even have the energy to struggle against the current pulling her under. Then the courtroom doors had burst open with a force that made everyone turn. Malik Thompson, all 4 feet of him, had walked down the center aisle carrying his grandfather's briefcase in one hand and an armload of law books in the other. The court officers had moved to intercept him, but his voice had rung out clear and strong. "Your Honor, I invoke Rule 1.14 of the Georgia Rules of Professional Conduct. As my mother's emergency representative and having demonstrated competency in legal matters, I request to address the court regarding gross violations of due process and constitutional rights." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the whisper of papers as Malik had reached the defense table and began unpacking his briefcase with the methodical precision of someone who'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. Judge Harrison's gavel had cracked like a gunshot. "This is highly irregular. Young man, this is a court of law, not a playground. Officers, please escort." But Malik was already speaking, his child's voice carrying the weight of carefully memorized statutes and passionate conviction. "Your Honor, I present my completed Georgia State Bar examination results." He'd pulled out papers bearing official letterhead, holding them high enough for the gallery to see. While minors cannot be licensed to practice law, nothing in Georgia statute prevents demonstration of legal knowledge. I scored 89%, higher than 70% of adult test takers. The murmur from the gallery had grown louder. Croswell had shot to his feet, face purpling with indignation, but Malik had continued before anyone could stop him. "Furthermore, I present evidence that attorney Thomas Brennan has been deliberately sabotaging my mother's defense." More papers emerged from the briefcase, emails obtained through Freedom of Information requests, filed from the public library's computer during the hours Malik should have been in school. These communications between Mr. Brennan's office and the prosecutor's team show clear collusion. They discussed plea arrangements before even meeting with my mother. They referenced the Morrison situation and keeping the nurse problem contained. This violates Rules 1.4, 1.7, and 8.4 of professional conduct. Each accusation had landed like a precision strike, Malik's young voice never wavering as he'd systematically dismantled the conspiracy against his mother. Judge Harrison, caught between rolling cameras and a gallery full of witnesses, had been forced to examine the documents. His face had paled with each page, recognizing the danger they represented not just to the case but to his own career. Malik had pressed his advantage, pulling out more evidence with the timing of a seasoned trial lawyer. The drugs allegedly found in my mother's car. I have here the evidence log from the police department. The bag's serial number doesn't match the intake form. The chemical analysis was performed by a lab technician who doesn't exist in any employment records. The chain of custody has a 3-hour gap that no one can explain. He'd spread the papers across the defense table like a general planning battle, each document a weapon against the lies that had imprisoned his mother. The arresting officer, Detective Raymond Collins, claimed to be on patrol that night, but payroll records show he was off duty. His personal vehicle's GPS, subpoenaed from his insurance company's safe driver program, places him at a bar 40 minutes away when the arrest supposedly occurred. The actual officer on duty, Patrolman Jennifer Martinez, filed a report about a traffic stop with no incidents that night, a report that was buried in the system until I found it. Malik's preparation had been extraordinary, the product of 3 months spent in libraries and civic buildings, learning to navigate bureaucracies that tried to keep their secrets hidden. Every lunch money saved had gone to copying fees. Every free moment had been spent reading his mother's old law books, understanding not just the law but how to use it as both shield and sword. The witness who'd recanted his statement about seeing Angela with drugs became Malik's next target. Marcus Johnson received 3 payments of $5,000 each from a shell company called Morrison Community Services. This company was registered 2 days after my mother witnessed Councilman Morrison's hit-and-run accident. Its only listed transactions are these payments to Mr. Johnson and a rental fee for a warehouse that doesn't exist. The financial documents had been the hardest to obtain, requiring Malik to understand corporate filings and trace money through deliberately obscured channels. But Angela had taught him, through her hidden books and whispered study sessions, that following the money often revealed the truth. I call for immediate dismissal based on prosecutorial misconduct, false arrest, conspiracy to pervert justice, and violations of my mother's 4th, 5th, and 14th Amendment rights. Malik had declared, his child's voice growing stronger with each word. Brady v. Maryland establishes that prosecution must disclose exculpatory evidence. Giglio v. United States requires disclosure of deals with witnesses. Turner v. United States affirms these obligations. Every single standard has been violated in this case. Croswell had tried to object, sputtering about proper procedures and the inadmissibility of evidence presented by a child, but Malik had anticipated every argument. Your Honor, Rule 402 of the Federal Rules of Evidence states that relevant evidence is admissible regardless of its source. The youth of the presenter doesn't negate the authenticity of official documents. The final blow had been devastating in its simplicity. Malik had pulled out one last set of papers, a judicial complaint filed with the state's oversight board. Your Honor, these documents detail your financial connections to this case. Your membership at Morrison Country Club, paid for by a nonprofit that Councilman Morrison chairs. Your wife's position on the Grady Hospital Board that suspended my mother without investigation. The campaign contributions from Morrison's PAC to your last election. Under Canon 2 of the Code of Judicial Conduct, you are required to recuse yourself from any case where your impartiality might reasonably be questioned. The trap had been sprung with the precision of a legal mastermind, executed by a boy who'd learned that sometimes David must study Goliath's weaknesses for months before picking up the stone. Judge Harrison's hands had trembled as he'd reviewed the complaint, seeing his career flash before his eyes. The gallery had fallen silent, everyone leaning forward to witness this impossible moment. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers frozen above the keys. Malik had stood perfectly still, his small frame dwarfed by the massive courtroom, but somehow filling it with his presence. Behind him, Angela had wept silently, seeing her son pay the price for her principles, using the tools she'd tried to hide to fight the battle she'd run from. The moment had stretched like a held breath, the entire system balanced on the edge of a child's courage. Your Honor, Malik's voice had softened but lost none of its power. 12 years ago, this same system forced my mother to choose between justice and her child. She chose me, burying her gift for the law to keep me safe. Today, her child chooses justice, not for revenge, but for truth. Because she taught me, through every hidden book and whispered lesson, that the law isn't about power or position. It's about truth standing up, even when it's small, even when it's scared, even when the whole world says to sit down. The words had hung in the air like a benediction, a child's faith in justice shaming every adult who'd forgotten why they'd once believed in it too. Judge Harrison's voice had cracked as he'd spoken the words that would echo through Atlanta's legal community for years to come. Case dismissed with prejudice. All charges dropped. The court orders immediate investigation into prosecutorial misconduct and police corruption related to this case. Marshal, remove the defendant's restraints immediately. The gavel had fallen with finality, but the courtroom had remained frozen in stunned silence. Then, from somewhere in the gallery, a single person had begun to clap. Then another. Then the entire room had erupted in applause that no amount of gaveling could stop. Angela Thompson, still in her orange jumpsuit but no longer in chains, had rushed to embrace her son, their tears mixing as they'd held each other in the center of a courtroom that had just witnessed justice delivered by the most unlikely advocate. As they'd prepared to leave, Croswell had slumped at his table, knowing his career had just ended. His junior prosecutors had already begun distancing themselves, suddenly remembering urgent appointments elsewhere. Brennan had tried to approach Angela, perhaps to apologize or explain, but Malik had stepped between them. "Mr. Brennan, your bar membership is under review. I'd suggest you focus on that instead of speaking to my mother." The threat from an 11-year-old should have been laughable, but everyone had seen what this child could do with documents and determination. Brennan had retreated, another casualty of his own corruption. Outside the courthouse, reporters had swarmed, but Malik had simply held his mother's hand as they'd walked through the crowd. He'd said nothing to the cameras, letting his actions speak louder than any interview could. Behind them, a young paralegal named Christina Martinez, no relation to the officer who'd filed the buried report, had approached hesitantly. "I was in the gallery," she'd said quietly. "I work for a firm downtown. We don't take cases like your mother's. We're told they're not profitable. But watching you today," she'd paused, swallowing hard. "Could you teach me how to fight like that? How to see what others miss?" Malik had reached into his briefcase one last time, pulling out one of his mother's old law books, its margins filled with her careful notes from years of secret study. "She never stopped being a lawyer," he'd said simply, handing over the book. "She just practiced in the shadows, waiting for justice to be safe again. It never got safe, so I made it brave instead." Christina had clutched the book like a sacred text, understanding that she held not just legal knowledge but a testament to resilience. As the Thompson family had walked away, she'd opened to the first page, seeing Angela's handwriting. "The law is not about what is easy or profitable, it's about what is right. Remember this when the world tells you to forget." The walk to their car had been surreal. Angela, still wearing the jail-issued clothing she'd been arrested in, had moved like someone in a dream. 3 weeks of imprisonment had ended in minutes, brought down by a child who'd refused to accept injustice as inevitable. As they'd reached their old sedan, the same one allegedly full of drugs that had never existed, Angela had finally spoken. "How did you know? The bar exam, the documents, the financial connections. Malik, you're 11 years old. How did you do this?" Her voice had held wonder and worry in equal measure, the mother in her calculating the cost of what her son had sacrificed to save her. Malik had smiled then, a child's smile breaking through the serious expression he'd worn like armor in court. "You taught me, Mom. Every night when you thought I was asleep, I heard you reading cases out loud, practicing arguments with yourself. When I found your real diploma hidden behind the family photos, I understood why you whispered instead of shouted. But whispers can become roars if you know how to amplify them." He'd pulled out a photo from his jacket pocket Angela on her law school graduation day, holding baby Malik, her face radiant with possibility. "This is who you really are. Not the nurse who keeps her head down, but the lawyer who stood up. I just reminded the world what it tried to make you forget." They'd driven through Atlanta in contemplative silence, past the hospital that had fired her, past the apartment complex that had evicted them, past all the places that had rejected Angela based on lies. But also past the library where Malik had studied, past the civic buildings where he'd learned to file requests, past the small victories that had led to this moment. The city looked different now, not because it had changed, but because they had. They'd proven that justice, while often delayed and frequently denied, could still be achieved by those brave enough to demand it. As they'd stopped at a red light, Angela had noticed something different about the streets. They no longer felt like a maze designed to trap her, but like a map full of possibilities. That evening, In a motel room paid for by a crowdfunding campaign that had sprung up within hours of the trial's end, Angela had sat with Malik as the news coverage played on every channel. Legal experts had debated the implications of what they'd witnessed. Some had called for immediate investigations into similar cases. Others had questioned how many innocent people sat in cells because they'd lacked an 11-year-old genius to save them. But one commentator, an elderly black judge named Carla Williams, had said something that had resonated. What we saw today wasn't just about legal brilliance. It was about love powerful enough to overcome fear, truth persistent enough to outlast lies, and courage young enough to believe change is possible. As Malik had drifted off to sleep, still wearing his grandfather's suit jacket like a superhero's cape, Angela had pulled out her hidden law books one last time. But now, instead of reading them in secret, she'd placed them on the motel desk in plain sight. Tomorrow, she'd have to figure out how to rebuild their lives. The apartment was gone, the job was gone, but something had been restored that was worth more than both her identity as someone who fought for justice. The woman who'd graduated at the top of her class, who'd once terrified corrupt cops with her questions, who'd been dangerous enough to silence, was still there. She'd just been waiting for someone to believe in her again. That someone had turned out to be the child she'd tried to protect from all of this. In the following days, the ripple effects had spread throughout Atlanta's legal system. Officer Collins had been arrested, his pattern of false arrests exposed. Councilman Morrison had resigned, facing charges for the hit-and-run and subsequent cover-up. Thomas Brennan had been disbarred, his collusion with prosecutors revealed in case after case. The lab technician who didn't exist had turned out to be a code name for falsified evidence, leading to hundreds of convictions being overturned. But Angela and Malik hadn't waited to see justice served to others. They'd packed their few belongings and prepared to start fresh, this time with Angela planning to take the bar exam again, to practice law in the light instead of the shadows. On their last day in Atlanta, they'd visited Emory Law School. Angela had wanted Malik to see where she'd studied, to understand the world she'd once inhabited. As they'd walked through the halls, a professor had recognized her not from recent news coverage but from 13 years ago. "Angela Richardson," he'd said, his voice full of regret. "I always wondered what happened to you. You were one of the most brilliant students I ever taught, when you disappeared." He'd trailed off, understanding now what they'd all been too comfortable to see then. That brilliance in the wrong skin color, with the wrong zip code, had been a threat to those who profited from injustice. "I didn't disappear," Angela had said quietly. "I was erased. But my son found me again." She'd put her hand on Malik's shoulder, feeling him stand a little taller. The professor had looked at Malik with something approaching awe. The bar exam results, the legal strategy, the research law students struggle with that level of complexity. Malik had shrugged with the casual confidence of a child who'd done the impossible because no one had told him he couldn't. "But my mom says the law is just organized common sense with Latin names. Once you understand that, the rest is just reading and reasoning." The professor had laughed, but it was laughter mixed with shame at how complicated they'd all made something that a child could see clearly. As they'd left the campus, Angela had made a decision. She wouldn't just return to law, she'd establish a clinic for others like her, people railroaded by a system designed to generate convictions rather than justice. She'd teach others what she'd taught Malik, that the law belonged to everyone, not just those who could afford its protection. The funding would come from the settlements already being offered by the city, the hospital, the prosecutor's office, everyone scrambling to avoid deeper investigation. But money had never been the point. The point was ensuring that no other mother would have to hide her strength to protect her child, that no other child would have to become a lawyer at 11 to save their parent. 6 months later, the Angela Thompson Justice Clinic had opened in the same neighborhood where she'd been arrested. The first client had been Darius Williams, the young man she'd failed to save 12 years earlier. Now 29, he'd spent over a decade in prison for a crime he hadn't committed. With Angela's help, his conviction had been overturned, his record cleared. As he'd walked free, he'd asked her why she'd come back, why she'd risked everything again. "Because my son taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear," she'd said. "It's acting despite fear. And because someone needs to stand between the system and the people it tries to crush." Malik, now 12 and officially the youngest person to pass the Georgia bar exam, even if he couldn't practice, had become a symbol of what was possible when knowledge met determination. He'd returned to school, but his classmates now looked at him differently, not as the kid whose mom got arrested, but as the boy who'd brought down corruption with nothing but truth and tenacity. He'd started a program teaching other kids about their legal rights, showing them that understanding the law was the first step to changing it. His presentations always began the same way. My mom taught me that justice isn't just for lawyers in expensive suits. It's for everyone brave enough to stand up and say this is wrong. The motel room photo of Angela and Malik, taken the night of the trial by a supporter, had become iconic, a mother in jail clothes and her son in an oversized suit, holding each other as justice finally arrived. It had been painted as a mural on the side of the courthouse, a reminder that sometimes the system's victims became its reformers. Tour guides had started, including it in their routes, telling the story of the nurse who'd been a lawyer, the child who'd been a hero, and the day Atlanta's legal system had been forced to confront its own corruption. But for Angela and Malik, it was simpler than all that symbolism. It was just a photo of the day they'd chosen each other over fear, truth over safety, justice over silence. Years later, when Malik actually became a lawyer, he'd keep that photo on his desk next to his mother's old law books. Clients would ask about it, and he'd tell them the story, always ending with the same words. The law isn't about power or position or precedent. It's about people. It's about that moment.